Two American pilots launched into the sky knowing the odds were insane. 60 enemy fighters heading straight for the fleet. There were no backups coming. No second chances. He'd already written letters home for friends who never returned, and now it might be his turn. They climbed into the sun, broke the formation, and tore through the enemy one by one. But the real shock didn't happen in the air. It happened the moment his wheels touched the carrier deck. When the engine died, the fuel was gone, and the fleet was still in danger. What happened next changed everything. At 7:30 in the morning, October 24th, 1944, a quiet moment on the deck of the USS Essex vanished in seconds. Commander David McCampbell pulled himself into the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat just as a radar operator raced across the flight deck with news no pilot ever wants to hear. The skies over the Philippines were filling fast. The Japanese had launched a massive strike, more than 60 fighters and dive bombers driving straight toward the American carrier force. McCampbell, 34 years old, already credited with 25 victories, had been sitting in the ready room when the alarm hit. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had just begun. Across hundreds of miles of Philippine waters, the largest naval battle of the modern era was exploding into motion. Every aircraft the Americans could launch was already in the air or being frantically fueled and armed. On the Essex, only 7 Hellcats were ready to fly. 7 fighters facing more than 60 incoming enemy aircraft. The numbers were vicious. Tactics manuals said attackers needed a 3-to-1 advantage. The Japanese had nearly 9-to-1. Air Group 15 had already buried 11 pilots in the last 3 months of combat. McCampbell knew every name. He had written the letters to their families, including the one for Lieutenant Morrison, lost over Formosa. Ensign Caldwell had fallen during the strikes over Manila. Lieutenant Commander Harris was still missing after the Taiwan raids. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at the American fleet, and the Navy was running dangerously low on seasoned pilots to meet the assault. The Essex stood exposed. The other carriers of Task Group 38.3 had sent up their combat air patrols, but they were stretched thin across 60 miles of open ocean. McCampbell checked his fuel gauge as his plane captain secured the straps. Half a tank. McCampbell checked his fuel gauge as his plane captain secured the straps. Half a tank. Not enough to top off. The enemy formation was 22 miles out, closing at 200 knots. He had barely 6 minutes before they reached striking distance. His F6F Hellcat carried formidable firepower, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds, 2,400 bullets ready to unleash. Beneath the cowling, the Pratt & Whitney R280 engine roared to life, 2,000 horsepower vibrating through the cockpit. Across the flight deck, 6 other Hellcats were spinning up. Ensign Rushing climbed into the plane beside him, while Lieutenant Hayes, Lieutenant Johnson, and 3 more pilots were pushed into position. 7 fighters against 60 enemies. As Air Group Commander, the decision fell entirely on McCampbell. Launch all 7 planes straight at the massive Japanese formation in a desperate gamble to break it apart, or split the force and risk losing everything before the bombers ever reached the carriers. The tactical manuals warned, never divide your fighters when outnumbered. But those rules assumed more than 7 planes. McCampbell had no luxury of numbers, only strategy, skill, and sheer nerve. On the radar, 60 blips appeared, 40 enemy fighters circling 20 dive bombers. The bombers were the real threat. One bomb hitting the Essex's flight deck could kill hundreds and cripple American air operations for months. Any Hellcat attempting a direct strike without clearing the fighters first would be torn apart. McCampbell faced an impossible choice, and the seconds to act were slipping away. McCampbell made his decision in the brief instant it took his plane captain to pull the wheel chocks. He pointed to 5 pilots, then gestured toward the southern quadrant. Attack the bombers. Turning to Rushing, he tapped his own chest. The 2 of them would take the fighters. 2 Hellcats against 40 Japanese Zeros and Oscars. He released the brakes and slammed the throttle forward. The Hellcat rolled down the deck and lifted into the thick, humid morning air over the Philippine Sea. Rushing followed 30 seconds behind. They climbed steadily, 3,000, 6,000, 10,000 feet. 15 miles ahead, slightly below them, the Japanese formation appeared as tiny dark specks on the blue water. 60 enemy aircraft, 2 American fighters. McCampbell armed his guns and glanced at the gauges. Half tanks, maybe 90 minutes of flight if he was careful. He eased the nose over and slipped into a shallow dive, approaching out of the sun. Climbing through 20,000 feet, he felt the altitude giving him what he needed: speed, options, gravity itself on his side. Below, 12,000 feet down, the Japanese formation droned on toward the American carriers, steady and unaware. Rushing held position 500 yards back and to the right, a perfect two-plane element. They had flown this pattern countless times over the Solomons and the Marianas. One leader, one wingman, strike from above, and let speed be the escape. The Japanese fighters formed a loose defensive circle around their bombers, mostly Mitsubishi A6M0s, swift, agile, and the finest carrier-based fighter Japan had produced. McCampbell had faced Zeros before. At low speed, they could outturn a Hellcat, and below 14,000 feet, they could climb faster. But the Hellcat carried weight, 2,000 pounds heavier than a Zero, and weight meant velocity in a dive. That velocity meant power. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat into a steep 60-degree dive. The airspeed needle surged past 300, 350, 400 knots. The enemy formation swelled in his gun sight. He locked onto a lone Zero trailing behind the main group. Always the straggler, the one the herd wouldn't notice until it was too late. At 800 yards, 600, 400, he pressed the trigger. The 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted, tracers streaking across the morning sky. The Zero's right wing shredded under the fire, and the fighter rolled inverted, plunging into a death spiral toward the ocean 4 miles below. The first kill. 8 more to shatter the American record. McCampbell yanked the Hellcat up hard. 4GS pressed him deep into his seat, and the wings groaned under the strain, but held. Climbing back to altitude, he spotted Rushing already in position. His wingman had mirrored the attack, taking down another Zero. 2 down. 58 remained. The Japanese formation fractured in seconds, fighters scattering, some diving, some climbing. Tactical cohesion vanished in the blink of an eye. McCampbell zeroed in on his second target, another Zero trying to climb to intercept him. A fatal mistake. From high altitude, the Hellcat held all the advantage. He dove again. Same approach. Same deadly result. The Zero erupted in a ball of orange flame, fuel and ammunition detonating in a cascade of secondary explosions. No parachute. Second kill. The battle fell into a brutal rhythm. Dive, fire, climb, repeat. McCampbell tore through the Japanese formation like a harvester cutting through wheat. Third Zero at 7:52. Fourth at 7:56. He stole a glance at the fuel gauge between attacks, the needle dropping faster than he expected. All the climbing was burning fuel at a punishing rate. The main tank was down to a quarter, so he switched to the auxiliary. Rushing stayed locked on beside him, firing short, precise bursts to conserve ammunition. Smart, disciplined flying. Fifth kill at 8:03. This time it was a Nakajima Ki, 43 Oscar, an Army fighter thrown into the mix with the Japanese Navy planes, a desperate measure. The Oscar, lighter and less armored than a Zero, shredded under McCampbell's guns like paper. He lost track of the kills as the pattern repeated. Dive, fire, climb, dive, fire, climb. His shoulders ached under the G-forces, sweat soaking his flight suit despite the cold air at 20,000 feet. The guns were blistering hot, the smell of cordite sharp even through his oxygen mask. Sixth kill. Seventh kill. The enemy formation had completely collapsed. Individual aircraft fled west toward Luzon. McCampbell checked his ammo. Fewer than 400 rounds left out of the original 2,400. In just 30 minutes, McCampbell had burned through 2,000 rounds. Rushing's Hellcat pulled alongside, signaling urgently, tapping his empty gun base, then slashing across his throat. Completely out of ammunition. All 400 rounds per gun expended. McCampbell faced a critical choice. Rushing was defenseless. The safest option was to escort him back to the Essex. But the sky still held enemy fighters. The carriers were still at risk. And McCampbell still had some ammunition. Not much, just enough for perhaps 2 more attacks. He glanced at his wingman, pointed toward another cluster of Zeros, and Rushing nodded, following him into yet another deadly dive. Rushing had no ammunition, but he understood the plan. Simply being there split the Japanese pilots' attention, forcing them to track 2 threats instead of 1. To the enemy, a dry Hellcat looked no different from one bristling with guns. The Japanese wouldn't realize the truth until it was far too late. McCampbell picked his 8th target, a Zero climbing in a tight turn. The enemy pilot reacted swiftly, reversing to meet them head-on. A classic Zero tactic designed to force a turning dogfight, where the lighter, more maneuverable aircraft had the advantage. McCampbell had seen this before. Coral Sea, Midway, the Marianas, Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots loved the head-on merge, but McCampbell refused to take the bait. He rolled his Hellcat inverted and pulled through, negative G-forces slamming him against his straps. Blood surged to his head, vision narrowing to a tight tunnel. He completed the roll and found himself perfectly positioned behind the Zero. A precise deflection shot, range 300 yards. He squeezed the trigger with a shorter burst, conserving precious ammunition, maybe 50 rounds. The enemy cockpit shattered, the canopy exploding in shards of plexiglass and aluminum. The fighter snap-rolled to the left and fell away. No fire, gravity claiming the pilot. 8th kill. 1 more to break the record. 1 more to make history. McCampbell climbed again, but the Hellcat felt sluggish. The engine ran rough, cylinder heads climbing deep into the red. McCampbell had been running full throttle for 40 minutes. The R-2800 engine was built tough, but even it wasn't designed for sustained combat at 20,000 feet in the tropical heat. At 8:40, he spotted his 9th target, a lone Zero fleeing west, trying to make it home. The pilot had seen enough, but McCampbell had other plans. He dove one final time. The Zero attempted to escape, but a Hellcat could outdive anything the Japanese had. Closing to 200 yards, McCampbell centered the gun sight on the engine cowling and unleashed his last extended burst. Tracers walked up the fuselage. The engine ceased. Black smoke poured from the cowling as the Zero nosed over into a vertical dive, disappearing into the cloud layer at 8,000 feet. 9th kill. 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed in just 90 minutes. An American single-mission record that no other Navy pilot would match during the war. McCampbell keyed the radio for the first time since takeoff and reported to the Essex. 9 confirmed kills. The radio operator asked him to repeat, and he did. 9 confirmed. Then he glanced at his fuel gauge, and his blood ran cold. The main tank was empty. The auxiliary tank read 1/8, maybe 20 gallons. At minimum cruise power, that was barely 30 minutes of flight. He scanned the horizon, searching for any recognizable landmarks. The Philippine coastline stretched to the west, Luzon, where the Japanese were retreating toward their bases around Manila. McCampbell had chased them nearly 100 miles from the American task force, and now the return to Essex loomed just as perilous. 30 minutes of fuel. The math didn't add up. He eased the throttle back to minimum power, 1,800 revolutions per minute. The Hellcat shuddered but stayed aloft. Rushing pulled alongside again, pointing at his own gauge and shaking his head. Both planes were running on fumes. McCampbell turned east and began the long glide back toward the fleet. Every foot of altitude was potential energy. a lifeline he could trade for distance when the engine finally surrendered. Every 1,000 feet of altitude offered roughly 2 miles of glide. At 18,000 feet, McCampbell could hope for 36 miles if luck held. The Philippine coastline slipped behind them, the open ocean stretching endlessly ahead, dark and deep. At those depths, the cold could kill a man in 30 minutes, even if he survived the crash. McCampbell had no intention of testing the statistics. He leaned the mixture to full, eyes glued to the fuel gauge. The needle hovered on empty. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled, running on vapor. Far ahead, the American fleet emerged on the horizon, tiny gray shapes against the blue. At 50 miles out, the engine coughed again. McCampbell reached for the fuel selector and switched tanks, checking the gauge. Nothing. Both tanks read empty. The Pratt & Whitney engine was running on nothing but residual fuel in the lines, vapor and hope. The propeller continued to turn, but the engine note had changed, rough and missing on 1 or 2 cylinders. The Hellcat was dying. Rushing flew 500 yards to his left, his wingman trailing a thin stream of white vapor. Oil temperatures were climbing, and his engine was in even worse shape than McCampbell's, punished by too many high-power maneuvers and repeated full-throttle climbs to 20,000 feet. The R-2800 engines were built for carrier operations, launch, fight, land. 90 minutes of continuous combat at full power, however, exceeded their design limits. McCampbell passed through 10,000 feet, still 40 miles from the Essex. Ahead, the carrier task force came into view. For carriers in a tight box formation, cruisers and destroyers forming a protective screen, white wakes slicing through the deep blue ocean. He began descending faster, trading precious altitude for distance. 8,000 feet, 7,000. The math was growing tighter with every passing second. At 6,000 feet, the first 5-inch shell exploded just 200 yards ahead. A black puff of smoke erupted nearby. Proximity fuse, American anti-aircraft fire. McCampbell's stomach dropped. The destroyer screen had spotted 2 aircraft approaching from the west, coming from the direction of the Japanese bases on Luzon. His IFF transponder should have identified him as friendly, but it failed. Radar operators had made errors. Another 5-inch shell exploded closer, 100 yards away, then another. The destroyers unleashed a full barrage. McCampbell shoved the stick forward, diving toward the wave tops. Rushing followed, both Hellcats plummeting 3,000 feet in 30 seconds. The anti-aircraft fire finally ceased, but McCampbell knew the danger wasn't over. He had faced this scenario before. The destroyers scrambled the combat air patrol. 4 Hellcats appeared at 2,000 feet, diving fast. VF, 19 markings from the USS Lexington. They were coming in hard, attack formation locked. McCampbell had no way to identify himself. His radio was set to the Essex's frequency, and switching channels would require letting go of the stick, something he couldn't risk in a failing aircraft. The 4 Hellcats closed to 1,000 yards, 800, 600. Gunports glinted. The lead fighter was lining up for a shot. McCampbell yanked hard left. For GS slammed him into the seat. The Hellcat sputtered, almost dying from the sudden throttle change. The American fighters followed through the turn, trying to force him into the water. It was standard intercept procedure for unidentified aircraft approaching the fleet. Rushing was in the same peril, 500 yards away, while 4 more American fighters closed in on him. 8 friendly planes nearly shooting down 2 of their own. McCampbell's engine coughed constantly, running on almost nothing. 3 miles from the Essex, he could see aircraft on the flight deck below. Yet the 4 Hellcats behind him continued closing. 400 yards, 300. Then, the lead fighter abruptly broke off. McCampbell didn't know why. Perhaps the pilot recognized the Air Group 15 markings on his tail, perhaps someone on Essex had radioed the CAP, or maybe it was sheer luck. The remaining 3 fighters peeled away and climbed into the sky. Rushing's 4 pursuers fell back, and just as suddenly as it had begun, the friendly fire incident ended. McCampbell's engine quit entirely, 2 miles from the Essex, complete power loss. The propeller windmilled in the slipstream, producing no thrust. He was gliding, airspeed at 120 knots, sinking 800 feet per minute. At 1,000 feet, he did the math. He would hit the water a mile short of the carrier. Then he spotted the USS Langley off his right wing. A light carrier, CVL 27, smaller than Essex, but her flight deck was clear. McCampbell lined up, knowing this was a dead-stick landing. No power, no margin for error. One chance. The carrier steamed steadily into the wind. Standard carrier procedures dictated every move. The wind added a few extra knots of airspeed over the deck. Maybe enough, maybe not. McCampbell was at 800 feet, 1 mile out, sink rate climbing. 700, 600. He dropped the landing gear. The hydraulics still held, pushed by gravity and residual pressure. The gear locked with a reassuring thump. He reached for the flaps, then hesitated. Deploying them would increase drag and steepen his glide, costing precious altitude. Gear down, flaps up. Committed. The USS Langley grew larger in his view. On the port side of the deck, the landing signal officer waved yellow paddles, giving the cut signal. Too high. Too fast. Wrong approach angle. McCampbell ignored the signal. There was no power to adjust, no throttle to respond. Only physics, gravity, momentum, and the last vestiges of airspeed. 500 feet, half a mile from the ship. He was going to make it, just barely. The Hellcat crossed the stern of the Langley at 50 feet. The landing signal officer dove into the safety net as McCampbell's landing gear cleared the round down by mere inches. The Hellcat slammed onto the deck. Hard. The oleo struts compressed fully. The tailhook caught the number 3 wire perfectly. The wire stretched as the Hellcat decelerated from 90 knots to 0 in 3 seconds. 8 GS slammed McCampbell forward, his head snapping against the headrest. The engine died the instant the tailhook snagged the wire. The propeller stopped turning, complete fuel starvation. Deck crew sprinted toward the Hellcat to unhook it and clear the landing area for the next aircraft. Standard procedure. But the hydraulics had no pressure. The engine-driven pump was dead. For sailors struggled to manually release the hook while McCampbell sat in the cockpit, eyes fixed on the fuel gauge registering absolute 0. 30 seconds later, Rushing landed, catching the number 2 wire. His engine quit as he rolled out. 2 dead Hellcats on Langley's deck, but both pilots were alive. Both aircraft were battered from relentless combat and punishing landings. The deck crew pushed the fighters to the forward parking area for immediate inspection. McCampbell climbed from his cockpit, legs trembling after 90 minutes of nonstop G-forces and a crash of adrenaline. A deck officer approached with a clipboard for the standard post-flight debriefing. McCampbell recited the numbers: 9 confirmed kills, 1 probable, 6 separate attacks on the main formation, all ammunition and fuel expended. The officer wrote it down, then asked him to wait. An ordnance chief climbed onto the Hellcat to inspect the guns, opening each ammunition bay, checking port and starboard. 2 rounds remained in total. Out of 2,400 rounds loaded that morning, McCampbell had fired 2,398 to 99.9% of his ammunition. The ordnance chief had never seen anything like it in 3 years of carrier operations. The fuel crew measured the tanks with a calibrated stick: main tank dry, auxiliary tank dry, reserve tank dry. For the last 5 minutes, the engine had been running on vapor, enough for maybe 10 more minutes of flight. Had McCampbell attempted to reach the Essex, he would have plunged into the ocean 3/4 of a mile short. The deck officer looked at him. 9 confirmed kills, 2 rounds remaining, 0 fuel, and forced to land on a different carrier because his own deck was fouled. Friendly fire from American destroyers and fighters had marked the return flight, but the deck officer had been on Langley since Guadalcanal and had seen hundreds of pilots land after combat. This was different. McCampbell asked about the other 5 pilots from Essex, the ones he had sent against the Japanese bombers. The officer checked the status board. All 5 had returned safely. 2 confirmed kills, 3 probables. No American aircraft lost. The Japanese strike had been shattered before reaching the carriers. No bombs hit their targets. No torpedoes found their mark. Task Group 38.3 had survived intact. McCampbell walked toward the island, eyes on the Essex, for miles away. Flight operations continued. Hellcats launched for combat air patrol. The battle raged on around him. October 24, 1944, was only the opening day of the largest naval engagement in history. Over the next 72 hours, 4 separate battles would erupt across the Philippine waters. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, the battle off Cape Engano, and the Battle of Samar. More than 200,000 sailors were involved. The Imperial Japanese Navy threw everything it had at the American invasion of Leyte. Operation Shogo, their final attempt to halt the Allied advance toward the home islands. McCampbell's 9 kills had shattered the morning air strike against Task Group 38.3, but the Japanese weren't finished. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi commanded the land-based naval aircraft on Luzon, preparing the next wave of attacks. The message was clear: return immediately for debriefing. A destroyer would transfer McCampbell back to his carrier. He glanced at Rushing, his wingman, sitting on the wing of his Hellcat. 6 confirmed kills for Rushing, 15 between them. More enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission than most squadrons achieved in an entire month. Rushing, just 24 years old and an ensign, was exhausted. This had been his first major combat action, and he would later be awarded the Navy Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. McCampbell climbed down to Langley's hangar deck and walked to the waiting whaleboat. The transfer would take 20 minutes through rough seas, 3-foot swells, requiring precise timing to reach Essex's boarding ladder safely. McCampbell grabbed the ladder and climbed 30 feet to Essex's main deck. An officer awaited him. Commander of Air Group 15, he was needed immediately in the intelligence center. Deep inside the carrier's hull, the center was a hive of activity. Maps covered every wall, tracking the Battle of Leyte Gulf in real time. Red markers showed Japanese fleet positions. Blue markers represented American forces. The Japanese center force, under Admiral Kurita, was steaming through the Sibuyan Sea. 5 battleships, including the colossal Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, all heading toward the San Bernardino Strait. If the Japanese broke through, they would strike the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf, putting the troops ashore at extreme risk. American carrier aircraft had been hammering the center force all morning, with Essex's dive bombers and torpedo planes joining the relentless attacks. The battleship Musashi had taken multiple torpedo and bomb hits, slowing, listing, but still afloat and deadly. She had been built to endure enormous punishment: 16-inch belt armor, 9-inch deck plating, the largest battleship ever constructed, 72,000 tons fully loaded. McCampbell studied the maps carefully. The tactical picture was constantly shifting, every marker a potential disaster or opportunity. The Japanese Southern Force was advancing through the Surigao Strait, 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, toward the waiting line of Admiral Oldendorf, 7 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. That clash would erupt after midnight, a textbook naval engagement, ship against ship, gun against gun. Yet the gravest danger lay to the north. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed south from Japan, and Admiral Halsey had taken the fast carrier task force to intercept them. Most of the American air power was now moving away from Leyte Gulf, leaving the center force dangerously exposed. If Halsey didn't return in time, the Japanese might break through unopposed. An intelligence officer briefed McCampbell on the afternoon air operations. Essex would launch a massive strike against the center force at 1,400 hours, maximum effort, every available bomber and torpedo plane. McCampbell would lead the fighter escort. His own Hellcat remained on Langley, damaged hydraulics, engine dead. A replacement fighter was being prepped by the plane captain even now. He had 90 minutes to rest, eat, and brief his pilots before the next launch. In the ready room, Air Group 15's pilots were already gathering for the afternoon briefing. 23 in total, some still buzzing from the morning combat air patrol. Others had struck the Japanese center force in the Sibuyan Sea. Lieutenant Commander Rigg had led the torpedo bombers against the battleship Musashi, scoring 8 confirmed torpedo hits. The massive warship was taking on water, yet still powered forward, still heading for San Bernardino Strait. The pilots now looked at McCampbell differently. Word of his 9 kills in a single mission, an American record, had spread through the ship. They had heard the radio transmissions, seen him, and rushing land on Langley with dead engines. Fighter pilots respected kills, but survival in the face of the impossible commanded an entirely different kind of reverence. By October 1944, McCampbell had been flying relentless combat missions for 7 months. Since April, Essex and Air Group 15 had struck the Marshall Islands, Truk, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Formosa, and now the Philippines. 6 months of near-constant operations, over 20,000 flight hours, and countless battles had forged the unit into a deadly force. Air Group 15 had destroyed 315 enemy planes in the air and 348 on the ground, more than any other air group in the Pacific. McCampbell himself had tallied 25 confirmed kills before that morning, with his previous single-day best recorded during the famed Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19, 1944. The Japanese had unleashed 400 carrier-based aircraft against the American fleet, and McCampbell had already claimed 7 of them in 2 separate sorties. The first strike, at 0100 hours, saw him take down 5 Yokosuka Judy dive bombers. Later, at 1530, he added 2 more zeros over Guam. 7 kills in a single day. He had become an ace in a day, the only American pilot to achieve that distinction twice. Now, after his 90-minute morning mission, he had 9 confirmed kills. The record would stand unchallenged for the remainder of the war. No other Navy pilot would match it. Lieutenant Cecil Harris came closest, with 7 kills in one mission over Formosa, but McCampbell had pushed the limits of what a single pilot could accomplish under perfect conditions. Everything had lined up that morning. Altitude advantage, a sky full of targets, disciplined bursts of fire, careful fuel management, and more than a little luck. As the intelligence officer resumed the afternoon briefing, the picture grew clearer. The Japanese center force was still driving east through the Sibuyan Sea. Admiral Kurita's original flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, had already been sunk earlier that morning by the submarine USS Darter. Kurita had transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. Her 9 18-inch main guns could hurl 3 200-pound shells more than 26 miles. A single hit could erase a destroyer from the ocean. At 1,400 hours, Essex would launch a strike of 36 aircraft to meet that threat. 12 Hellcat fighters, 12 Helldiver dive bombers, 12 Avenger torpedo planes, a full strike package. McCampbell would lead the fighter element, tasked with suppressing the Japanese anti-aircraft fire while the bombers struck Musashi and Yamato. The mission was perilous. Both battleships bristled with more than 150 anti-aircraft weapons, 25mm machine guns, 40mm Bofors, dual-purpose 5-inch guns, creating a deadly curtain of flak around the ships. McCampbell checked his watch. 1,300 hours, 1 hour to launch. He walked to the flight deck, spotting his new Hellcat ready near the island. Aircraft number 47, not his usual mount, but mechanically identical. Same R2800 engine, same 6.50 caliber guns, for 100 rounds per gun, ready for war. The plane captain had already completed the pre-flight inspection. Oil levels checked, fuel tanks topped off, oxygen bottle full, guns loaded and charged. The flight deck was a controlled chaos. Aircraft handlers positioning planes for launch, ordnance crews loading 500-pound bombs under the Helldivers, and Mark 13 torpedoes beneath the Avengers. Torpedoes were delicate instruments. Drop them at the wrong altitude or airspeed, and they would tumble and sink harmlessly. McCampbell climbed into the cockpit of Aircraft 47. The seat was still warm from the morning's mission. He strapped in, adjusted the rudder pedals, set his oxygen, ran through the familiar pre-flight routine. Hundreds of flights. Yet this one carried the weight of 9 kills already earned and another strike against the most heavily defended targets in the Japanese fleet. At 13:55, the launch order came. McCampbell's Hellcat roared down the deck and lifted into the afternoon sky. 11 more fighters followed, then the dive bombers, then the torpedo planes, 36 aircraft forming up over Essex, ready to strike. The strike group turned west, heading into the Sibuan Sea, toward Musashi and Yamato, straight into the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft fire in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The afternoon assault was relentless. McCampbell led his fighters in precise, strafing runs against the destroyer screen, suppressing 40mm guns and forcing the gunners to seek cover, clearing a path for the dive bombers and torpedo planes. That day, Musashi endured 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes before finally capsizing and sinking at 19:30 hours, taking 2,300 crew with her, the largest warship ever destroyed by aircraft. McCampbell returned to Essex at 1700, having completed one more mission that day, with 2 additional combat sorties over the following 48 hours. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had raged across 400 miles of open ocean. By October 27th, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered catastrophic losses. For carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 26 warships totaling 300,000 tons. The Japanese Navy would never again operate as an effective fighting force. Commander David McCampbell flew his final combat mission on November 14, 1944, as Air Group 15 returned to the United States for rest and refit. Over his career, McCampbell had completed 212 combat sorties, scored 34 confirmed aerial kills, and destroyed 21 aircraft on the ground. He emerged as the Navy's top fighter ace, the ace of aces, and the only fast carrier task force pilot awarded the Medal of Honor for aerial combat. In January 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt personally presented Commander David McCampbell with the Medal of Honor. The citation highlighted his extraordinary skill and bravery, destroying 7 enemy planes during the Battle of the Philippine Sea and 9 more during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, all while facing overwhelming odds. His actions shattered the enemy formation, forcing them to abandon their attack before a single aircraft could reach the fleet. McCampbell survived the war and continued his Navy career, retiring as a captain in 1964 after 31 years of service. He lived a quiet life in Florida, occasionally giving interviews and speaking at naval aviation events, sharing the story of his legendary missions. David McCampbell never considered himself a hero, just a pilot who did his duty. He passed away on June 30, 1996, at the age of 86, and was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. In his honor, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS McCampbell, DDG-85, was commissioned in 2002. The very F6F Hellcat he flew on October 24, Bureau number 70143, is preserved at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Navy blue, white stars, and 34 kill markings on its fuselage tell the story. 2 Hellcats against 60 Japanese fighters, 9 kills in 90 minutes, and an engine that died the instant he landed. 80 years later, the record still stands. Commander McCampbell demonstrated what one pilot, with perfect training, tactics, and courage, could accomplish when everything was on the line. If this story inspired you the way it inspired us, hit that like button. Every like helps share these forgotten stories with more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale of real heroism. Every day, we rescue stories from dusty archives. Pilots who saved entire fleets through skill, courage, and sheer determination. These were real people facing impossible odds. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from: the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world. Share if someone in your family served, or just say hello. You're not just a viewer, you're helping keep history alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Commander David McCampbell's bravery is remembered.